So let's cut to the chase here. Why? What did Russia, or at least Putin, think he had to gain by starting this war? It's easy to forget now, with Russia struggling to hold on to its marginal gains, that this was supposed to be the easy part. Even if Russia had gotten its 3-day victory in the conventional war, there was always an even bigger quagmire waiting for them there at the finish line. If they installed a friendly government and left, it would immediately be overthrown. If they stayed, they'd have to face an insurgency. And if they tried to just stop at conquering half the country, they'd have to defend a more than 500-mile-long border. So, what was the plan here? I've read a lot of theories, from Putin going after Ukraine's natural gas reserves to a theory that the Kremlin is enthralled to insane philosophers who all talk like Final Fantasy villains.
Every so-called truth is the matter of believing. So we believe in what we do, we believe in what we say, and that is the only way to define the truth.
American cable news pundits seem to switch between thinking it's because he's gone COVID isolation crazy or because he's always harbored a secret desire to reunify the USSR. For instance, did you know that Vladimir Putin once said
the collapse of the Soviet Empire was a great tragedy?
Vladimir Putin was the man who described the collapse of the USSR as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe.
The collapse of the Soviet Union, quote, the greatest catastrophe.
The greatest geopolitical tragedy.
As the greatest tragedy of the 20th century.
Not just a great tragedy, but the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Never mind World War II.
Even Putin can't decide on a single story. One day he's claiming he needs to resolve the imaginary humanitarian crisis in Donetsk, and the next he's writing insane 7,000-word essays on how Ukraine and Russia are spiritually bonded. And what about the Russian people? Why are they going along with this? Theories seem to range from them being completely propagandized to them just all being orcs. And it's hard not to feel like all of these theories leave a lot to be desired, even if you combine them. However, there's one theory I feel compelled to debunk in detail because it is very specific, it's materialist, it's intuitive, and you sound like a rational, big-brain geopolitics understander when you repeat it. And it embodies a whole historical narrative of Russian-American relations that is very popular, even among opponents of Putin's war. This is, of course, the theory that Russia is acting in preemptive self-defense. Self-defense against American aggression, best embodied by America's decision to expand NATO to Eastern Europe, including, potentially, Ukraine.
In Washington, the foreign ministers of Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Norway, Portugal, and the United States signed with the nations of Western Union the North Atlantic Pact. This was no treaty aimed at aggression, but a pledge to cooperate in defense of the peace.
For those catching up, NATO is a mutual defense pact. If one country is attacked, every other country in NATO is obliged to help defend it. But if one country decides to go out on its own and start a war, the rest of NATO can say, you're on your own. Since the alliance was founded at the start of the Cold War to deter Soviet power creep, expanding it eastward could reasonably be interpreted as an attempt to strangle Russia, at a time when America was supposed to be softening its posture towards Russia. After all, how would America like it if China formed a military alliance with Mexico? But in many ways, the theory that America provoked the war through NATO expansion isn't just about NATO. It's an elaborate narrative of 30 years of American aggression and Russian victimization. There are several lectures that have gotten very popular on YouTube that explain this narrative, but the most watched is this one, from renowned international relations scholar John Mearsheimer.
The Russians didn't conquer or invade Crimea because they had a leasing agreement. There's a naval base at Sevastopol, and the Russians were leasing that naval base from Ukraine. So they had military forces there.
Mearsheimer has developed a reputation among certain communities as the Cassandra of the Russo-Ukrainian War, and as a result has become an extremely polarizing figure. I've linked his lecture and others in the description, but for the sake of brevity, I'll summarize. Allow me to present the great NATO sob story of 1991 to 2014. It's 1990, and Secretary of State Jim Baker has... Oh, no. I can't do voices. We're going to have to do this normal voice. It's 1990, and U.S. Secretary of State Jim Baker and Chairman of the USSR Mikhail Gorbachev are negotiating what to do about Germany. Now that the wall has come down, Gorbachev wants Germany to leave NATO, and America wants Germany to stay in NATO, even after it absorbs East Germany. So in order to get Gorbachev's agreement to let East Germany join NATO, Jim Baker promised America would never expand NATO to any countries to the east of Germany. That should have been the happy end of the story, but America had other plans. Because soon after that meeting, America immediately engineered the collapse of the Soviet Union, then forced the newly born country of Russia to destroy its own economy by privatizing too much. Or too quickly, or by giving Russia not enough aid money, or by giving Russia too much aid money, or by conditioning the aid too much, or by conditioning the aid not enough, or something. I don't know. It depends on who you ask. Everyone kind of glosses over this point. Then, with Russia crippled, America went back on its word and annexed Poland, Czechia, and Hungary into NATO, and then lied about there ever having been an agreement. Then it refused to let Russia join NATO, proving the open door policy was a lie and that the expansion was aimed more towards hemming in Russia. Then it bombed Serbia for no reason, tore up the anti-ballistic missile treaty, immediately started building interceptors, then it annexed the Baltic states, putting NATO troops and missiles within spitball range of St. Petersburg, and it was only finally when America was getting ready to finish the job by annexing Georgia and Ukraine that Russia decided it had no choice but to push back and defend itself by invading first Georgia and then Ukraine. But the American empire, drunk on its arrogance and the blood of countless brown people, instead of taking no for an answer, refused to acknowledge Russia's right to defend itself, forcing Russia to escalate. Now, did America say and do those things? Some of it, but, there's a lot of missing context. And well, it might be easier to go back to the beginning. Let's roll the tape back and start over.
By the time the summit convened this morning, President Bush and Secretary of State Baker had shifted its spotlight.
So, in a meeting, Jim Baker does make an offer to not expand NATO eastward, but it's not clear if he meant within Germany or in Europe as a whole, because before he can discuss it further, President Bush tells him to take the offer back. But for a very convoluted set of reasons, Gorbachev comes away believing that he has an implicit agreement that NATO won't expand. Why didn't Gorbachev push for an explicit agreement? Because he was desperate for cash.
But the Soviet president's biggest headache is surely the economy, deteriorating by the day. Westerners who work in the Soviet Union say it's like living in a third world country. Upper Volta with rockets is the way one put it.
Gorbachev was taking heat from all sides. The leaders of the republics wanted more autonomy. The people wanted an end to empty shelves. And the hardliners in the KGB wanted Gorbachev to focus on holding together the empire. So Gorbachev, to keep his head above water, brought together a team of experts and economists, and they created a plan for a relatively quick but orderly transition from an entirely state-run economy to a mixed market economy. The plan was called the 500 Days Program, and it would keep the Union together, get food back on the shelves, and provide enough autonomy for the republics to be happy without having to dissolve the Soviet Union. But for it to work, the Soviet Union was going to need a lot of aid money. So Gorbachev spent the first half of 1991 going around the West trying to sell the plan, and the answer he got back from the United States was, maybe later. Well, that's fine. Gorbachev would just have to hold on for another year. He was still getting money from the Germans, and with that, he could buy...
В связи с невозможностью по состоянию здоровья исполнения Горбачевым Михаилом Сергеевичем своих обязанностей президента СССР.
They first moved in at 4 a.m., the first sign of the coup d'etat that removed Mikhail Gorbachev from power. With tanks in Red Square, the official word from the new government, calling itself the National Emergency Committee, was that the architect of Glasnost and Perestroika was too ill to continue in office.
Mikhail Gorbachev is now on vacation. He is very tired after these many years, and he will need some time to get better.
Tens of thousands filled Leningrad's Palace Square to demonstrate against the coup and cheer their republic leader, Boris Yeltsin.
Перед всем миром, подрывая наш престиж в мировом сообществе, возвращает нас к эпохе холодной войны.
Yeltsin's supporters reacted with their bare hands, building makeshift barricades with whatever piece of disused machinery or brickwork was available.
Generally speaking, around the Russian Federation building, people are defying the 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. curfew. The people there say that they do not obey the laws of the military junta. They obey only the laws of Russia and the decrees of Boris Yeltsin.
How does a ragtag crowd prepare to fight a division of tanks? They toss a few more bricks on their flimsy barricade, pile up sticks and stones, and post a few more slogans.
The Soviet Union has entered its second night under military rule after a day of growing defiance and rising fears of bloodshed.
There has been now a report in from Reuters, the British news agency, that 3 people were shot dead outside the Russian parliament by Soviet tank crews.
Military convoys were seen heading out of Moscow. Tank drivers confirmed the coup was ending. To people manning the barricades here, the first sign the coup was faltering lay in the fact there was no all-out attack on the Russian Federation headquarters. The withdrawal came after dissension had developed in the military. At least 2 crack airborne divisions revealed they had thrown their allegiance to Yeltsin.
Less than 3 days after being placed under house arrest by communist hardliners, the Soviet president is to return to Moscow to retake the reins of government. The fate of the coup plotters remains unknown.
The end of the rally, the Russian flag was hoisted above the parliament building in place of the hammer and sickle.
Tens of thousands of people outside Boris Yeltsin's headquarters were elated. In their view, he had saved the day. Victoriously, they waved the Russian flag. And one speaker said, the black night of fear had become a new day of freedom.
The attempted coup of August 1991 only lasted 3 days, but that was more than enough to convince Ukraine that it couldn't wait for a compromise anymore. It declared independence 5 days later. But you already know the rest of Ukraine's story. Russia, on the other hand, faced the prospect of a majority Muslim and Asian Soviet Union. So Russia decided to quit the Union too, and refocus on rebuilding its economy under the guidance of its newly sovereign president, Boris Yeltsin.
It is indeed a great honor for me to address the Congress of the great land of freedom as the first ever, over 1,000 years of history of Russia, popularly elected president, as a citizen of the great country which has made its choice in favor of liberty and democracy.
But the now Russian reformers realized they faced a much starker choice. Unlike the other republics, the power ministries of the Russian state, the KGB, the ministers of the heavy industries, and the military-industrial complex were still being run by people either involved with or at least sympathetic to the coup. Yeltsin became convinced that if he wanted to stave off another reactionary putsch, he'd have to disband them, and that the only way to get a market system in place was to do it all at once in order to make it a fait accompli before anyone could stop him, even though this would mean privatizing property before actually having a way of protecting property rights, or ending price controls without controlling the money supply, or restructuring the economy without building a social safety net. In other words, their choice was between destroying the state or going back to the Brezhnev era. So the reformers became revolutionaries, and Russia's experiment in social democracy became an experiment in anarcho-capitalism, with predictable results.
Some prices had jumped even more than the 3, 4, or 5 times they'd expected. This butter was selling for 8 times the price it could have been bought for yesterday.
President Yeltsin emerged as the winner of a bloody power struggle with his opponents in parliament and their allies on the streets.
Outside the building, bodies still lay where they fell. There was still no official estimate of the number killed inside, though the city medical authorities said nearly 500 had been treated for injuries.
Over the weekend, Russia sent a force of more than 40,000 into the Republic of Chechnya and heading towards the capital of Grozny.
Troops from Russia's Interior Ministry scramble at the sight of an approaching armored personnel carrier. They don't know if it's one of theirs or one of the Chechens. As it passes, they open fire, wildly, still none the wiser who they're firing at.
Starovoytova was gunned down in the hallway of her St. Petersburg apartment in late November. Most Russians regard the killing of this pro-democracy member of parliament as a political murder and as evidence that their country's post-Soviet reform era is ending.
For Russian people, democracy is synonym of criminal anarchy. They never saw democracy as working rule of the law mechanism. They don't know what it is.
Panicky Russians tried to withdraw their savings from banks while the country's financial system appeared to teeter on the brink of collapse.
The government virtually defaulted on its debt, and the ruble crashed in August.
Russia has continued to pound villages with their heavy guns, a tactic which the Chechens say has caused numerous civilian casualties.
At times, Russian soldiers have shut down the Ingushetia border and even shot at the fleeing refugees.
Commandos stormed a school in southern Russia today where militants held hundreds of hostages. Russian news accounts said more than 200 people were killed, more than 700 wounded. Many were children.
An inflation crisis, a parliamentary crisis, a street crime crisis, an organized crime crisis, an official corruption crisis, an alcoholism crisis, a banking crisis, a sovereign debt crisis, 2 civil wars, and an Islamist insurgency, all in the span of 10 years. And the KGB hardliners who forced this outcome would spend the next 30 years blaming foreigners and Jews. Meanwhile, in America,
today, a generation raised in the shadows of the Cold War assumes new responsibilities in a world warmed by the sunshine of freedom.
Bill Clinton takes office in 1993. With his 0 years of foreign policy experience on a platform 100% focused on domestic issues, he immediately faces a dilemma. Russia is on fire, and it looks like there's already a 50-50 chance it's a lost cause for the next 20 years. Unless you do something to protect the other countries of Eastern Europe, they might get dragged down with it. But if you make moves on those countries, Russians would interpret it as aggression, and you might accidentally push Russia into the abyss by trying to hedge your bets, when being nice to Russia might move it closer to America. And the foreign policy establishment in America seemed to be almost split 50-50 on what to do next. So why did America ultimately decide to take its chances with antagonizing an incredibly unstable Russia? That's where the agency of Eastern Europe comes in. You will sometimes see people who supported NATO expansion complain that the NATO expansion sob story ignores the fact that Eastern Europe wanted to join NATO.
Let me in! Let me in!
Saying America expanded NATO basically treats these countries as pawns rather than real people with real aspirations. But that argument's wrong, because even that argument understates Eastern Europe's agency. Countries like Poland didn't get into NATO by just begging until America took pity. Poland blackmailed its way into NATO. In 1994, Bill Clinton's first plan for Eastern Europe was not to expand NATO, but rather to create a NATO holding room called the Partnership for Peace.
This partnership will advance a process of evolution for NATO's formal enlargement. It looks to the day when NATO will take on new members who assume the alliance's full responsibilities. It will create a framework in which former communist states and others not now members of NATO can participate with NATO members in joint military planning, training, exercises, and other efforts.
In the PFP, everyone in Europe could join at once with little fanfare. PFP would allow Eastern Europe and America's military to collaborate, thus helping to facilitate their democratic transition, and it also meant you could do all the prep work for letting countries into NATO without announcing it and hurting Russia's feelings. But for the 3 then 4 countries at the western end of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, this was not good enough. They wanted a security guarantee. They wanted NATO's Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. And no one wanted it more than Poland. So, the president of Poland invited Boris Yeltsin to a state dinner, got him drunk, and tricked him into signing a letter saying that Russia didn't mind if Poland joined NATO. When that didn't work, Polish officials started implying that without Article 5 protection, Poland would have no choice but to defend itself by pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And when that didn't work, Eastern Europe moved on from the nuclear option and tried the real nuclear option.
Today we're pleased to be introducing the NATO Enlargement Facilitation Act. And we're honored to be joined by a true hero of the Cold War, Lech Walesa.
Poland and Hungary share our Western values, our Western standards, and there is no reason or excuse for the unending delay which the Clinton administration has orchestrated in not implementing this much-needed expansion of NATO for the future security of Europe and the United States. We cannot use the excuse of a Russian election or real or perceived objections of any Russian leader to what is in the best interest of the people of Europe and the United States. I am confident that a Dole administration will pursue this issue as a high priority.
They started coming to Washington and meeting with Republicans. You have to understand, it wasn't just that names like Lech Walesa and Václav Havel carried a lot of weight internationally. There were also still huge émigré communities from these countries in the United States, and most of them had settled in the swing states of the Midwest. Walesa and Havel even implying they would campaign for the Republicans was terrifying, a fear which only got worse after the Democrats were wiped out in the 1994 midterm elections. So Clinton gave in.
While the partnership is not NATO membership, neither is it a permanent holding room. It changes the entire NATO dialogue so that now the question is no longer whether NATO will take on new members, but when and how.
There were good but wrong, reasons to think that Russia would, even with this provocation, still tolerate it and keep moving towards the West, even possibly joining NATO. One reason was China. It was not exactly hard to predict that the main challenge in the decades to come to American hegemony was going to come from the rapidly growing nuclear power with 4 times America's population, and the Chinese government was and is notoriously mercurial. So one outcome America was banking on was that Russia would realize it had more to fear from China than from America, and look to America for protection.
I had one interesting conversation with Ziganov, was repeated with Levin. They talked about they don't want this NATO expansion, they know it's not in their security interest, and on, and said, well, and if you do that, we may have to look to China. And I couldn't help using the colloquial expression from my state by saying to Ziganov, lots of luck in your senior year. Good luck. And if that doesn't work, try Iran. I'm serious. I said that to them.
But from Russia's point of view, Chinese unpredictability was a reason to never join NATO, because joining NATO would put Russia on the front line of any Chinese-American confrontation. But Russia also constantly gave off mixed signals. In addition to the permission letter Yeltsin gave to Poland, Russia could never get its story straight as to what its objections to NATO expansion were. Sometimes they seemed to want NATO in its entirety to be replaced by a militarized OSCE. Sometimes Yeltsin's officials would claim that, actually, they didn't mind if NATO expanded, but they were worried how nationalists and voters within the country would react. But most often, opponents of NATO expansion would complain that NATO expansion was humiliating.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about. You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences.
And complaining about humiliation was probably the worst way to convince America not to expand NATO, because from America's point of view, humiliation is just an inevitable part of losing your empire. The Dutch had to be humiliated at Surabaya, the British had to be humiliated at Suez, the French had to be humiliated at Oran, and America had to be humiliated in Saigon. But they all got over it. Kind of. Losing your empire is supposed to be humiliating. You did a bad thing, so Russia would get over it. It was hoped.
The Kremlin's public opposition to enlargement, in my view, is largely a question of a psychological problem they are undergoing now. Connected with the loss of empire, wounded pride, and most importantly, uncertainty about Russia's place in the world of the 21st century. And were you in their spot, you would be the same, in my view, and I would.
But this is where another important bit of context usually gets lost. Clinton didn't just announce the expansion of NATO, he went to Yeltsin and got Yeltsin to agree to let it happen. Because here's the thing about NATO expansion, Russia was actually powerful enough to prevent it. They had demonstrated that in 1992, when Russia ran the same playbook in Moldova that they would play in Ukraine 22 years later.
The president of Moldova today accused Russia of waging an undeclared war against his former Soviet republic. He said Russian members of a former Soviet Red Army stationed in Moldova were fighting alongside Slavic separatists against the Moldovan government.
Funding an ethnic separatist war, dividing the country de facto but not de jure, and using the violence to arm twist Moldova into agreeing to never join NATO. And even if they hadn't, the Russians still had a lot of leverage in the form of nuclear proliferation. Everyone understood this. They just didn't like saying it. So when Yeltsin started complaining that NATO expansion violated the unwritten agreement from the German reunification deal, publicly the United States said there was no agreement, and it didn't need Russia's permission. While privately, Clinton tried to offer concessions to Yeltsin in order to buy his cooperation. So Clinton gave Yeltsin $4.5 billion in aid, a promise that nuclear weapons wouldn't be deployed in the new member states, an agreement that no major conventional weapons or permanent bases would be deployed in the new member states, and most importantly, an agreement not to announce any of this until the autumn of 1996. Why was that so important? Because Russia held its presidential elections in the summer of 1996. and America held its presidential election in November of 1996. So the fall of '96 was the Goldilocks period where it could come soon enough to help Clinton politically, but would do the least damage to Yeltsin politically.
Today, I want to state America's goal. By 1999, NATO's 50th anniversary, and 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the first group of countries we invite to join should be full-fledged members of NATO.
But why lie about it? For one, it served the political purposes of both countries. For Clinton, it allowed him to look tough for Republicans, who were rabidly hostile to anything that looked like multilateralism, and it kept America's options open in the future. Also, acknowledging a Russian veto would be a de facto repudiation of the Helsinki Final Act, the treaty saying European countries could choose their own alliances. More importantly, for Yeltsin, it was political cover from the nationalists for taking the deal. You see, he wasn't trading away Poland for campaign cash, he was being steamrolled by America against his best efforts. And it worked. For Yeltsin and Clinton. But the relationship between Yeltsin and Clinton was somewhat special. While they personally liked each other, they couldn't really bridge the gap in trust between their respective countries. In their attempts to bring America and Russia closer together, both of them were constantly sabotaged by their legislatures, and both were hounded by accusations that they were selling the country out to the other side. And soon both would be replaced by decidedly more aggressive successors.
The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
With George Bush, there's less nuance to add.
We spent a lot of time in our relationship trying to get rid of the Cold War. It's over. It ended.
He did unilaterally tear up the anti-ballistic missile treaty, not even giving Congress, let alone Russia, much of a heads up. He did invade Iraq and convince the world that America was too megalomaniacal to be trusted as world police. He did start building interceptors in Europe. And last but not least, he did push to get Ukraine and Georgia into a NATO membership action plan, against the advice of France, Germany, and several of his own advisors. And instead of offering to trade Russia something for it, he just did it out of the blue.
Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
And boy, did Russia respond.
It was a war that lasted only 6 days, but which had a profound effect on a country and a region on the edge of Europe.
So, case closed, right? The great NATO sob story is still basically right. If America had just shown more restraint on NATO, Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine. And yeah, the NATO sob story does, I think, explain, if not justify, the 2008 invasion of Georgia. But we're talking about Ukraine, not Georgia. And 6 years had passed in between the two wars. And it's those 6 years in which the great NATO sob story goes from sort of having a point to just shameless lying. Because it was in 2008 when the great NATO sob story actually gained a lot of fans, both inside and outside the foreign policy establishment. And John Mearsheimer's brand of realism-influenced restraint gained a number of admirers. And one of them was now the 44th President of the United States.
In a Cold War, in which Muslim-majority countries were too often treated as proxies without regard to their own aspirations, I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning.
Once Barack Obama became president, Russia was allowed back into the G8. A deal was made to move the interceptors out of Europe and move them to boats in the Black Sea. And while the US never publicly renounced letting Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, Obama also reiterated that to join, countries needed territorial integrity and a referendum on joining. Georgia didn't have full territorial integrity, and in Ukraine, a majority of the population was against entering NATO.
President Obama talked as if it would need a referendum, it would need reforms before any new countries, for example, Georgia and Ukraine, join NATO. Was this new policy? Was he saying something new here?
Absolutely not. That's been the requirement. Those are requirements for NATO membership since NATO began, and so we're not seeing anything new. That was just a restatement.
But to state it in the way he did with that audience, what was he trying to do?
I don't want to overinterpret.
The Ukrainians moved on, elected Yanukovych, and agreed to host a Russian military base on Crimea for the next 30 years, locking itself out of NATO until the 2040s. And this rapprochement worked, at first. Russia agreed to a massive reduction in strategic nuclear arms, agreed to let American troops travel through Russia to Afghanistan, and put sanctions on Iran to pressure them into nuclear talks. And then the Maidan happened.
Protesters here are fighting back.
attempting to defend themselves with fireworks and Molotov cocktails.
And Russia went crazy, killed thousands of innocent people, and scapegoated America for it anyway. And no one in America could see any compelling reason for why it happened. That's why people like Barack Obama and Angela Merkel kept bending over backwards to offer Russia off-ramps. It's not because they liked or respected Russians more than other Eastern Europeans, it's just that they'd both more or less come to the conclusion that Vladimir Putin had simply made a mistake out of pique, and could thus be lured back with the right encouragement. But as we went over in part 2, not only did Putin refuse every off-ramp, he kept escalating throughout 2014 despite already having a practical assurance that Ukraine couldn't join NATO. And then, even though America couldn't even be bothered to send Ukraine weapons, Russia decided to escalate the Ukraine conflict further into a second Cold War by attacking the American elections in 2016, a move that completely backfired and led to America sending Ukraine weapons. This is Putin's master tactical plan. The people who made their name on the great NATO sob story, like John Mearsheimer, just kind of skip this part now. And that's why Washington hates these people. It's not because he's telling them hard truths they don't want to hear. It's because America did what he wanted for 6 years, and when that didn't work, instead of admitting fault, he just furiously rewrote history to blame them so he could pretend he was still right. And that type of careerist historical revisionism would be forgivable if there was nothing at stake but his reputation. But there is substantially more at stake now.
There are many people who say the Russians are going to go on a rampage, they're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia, and so forth and so on. That's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that. You remember what happened when the Russians invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Iraq? You remember what happened when the Israelis invaded southern Lebanon? You want to stay out of these places. In fact, if you really want to wreck Russia, what you should do is encourage it to try and conquer Ukraine. Putin, again, is much too smart to do that.
So, was NATO expansion a bad idea? Maybe, probably, yes it was. At a time when America should have been paying special attention to stabilizing Russian democracy, Bill Clinton corrupted that relationship in order to rush through a policy that didn't need to be rushed to satisfy a special interest voting bloc for an October surprise campaign stunt in an election that he would have won anyway. And everyone in Washington just kind of crossed their fingers and hoped everything would work out, because it was, after all, the end of history. But does NATO's expansion justify Russia's war on Ukraine? Not in the moral sense, just in a amoral geopolitics sense. No. You see, the point of the NATO sob story isn't really geopolitics. It's about making the case that America is especially evil and duplicitous. And America is not especially duplicitous. America is not anything. Because countries are not actually sentient balls with enduring personality traits. They're ideas. America can't have a duplicitous foreign policy. It doesn't have a foreign policy at all. Presidents have foreign policies. And there's less continuity between them than people would like to imagine. For instance, when Yeltsin first started complaining about how NATO expansion violated an agreement with James Baker, there was no one in the State Department who had worked for Bush on Russian issues anymore, and the Clinton guys had barely been briefed by their predecessors. So they had to spend a week just tracking down retired German and American officials to ask what Boris Yeltsin was talking about. But the great NATO sob story isn't interesting because it's true or because it's false, but because it illustrates the perennial problem of foreign relations between democracies and autocracies. Autocracies tend to see the chaotic wheeling and dealing of democracies as malicious subterfuge. And democracies tend to think their problems with an autocracy will be solved by the next regime change. And so hurt feelings are almost guaranteed in the Russian-American relationship. But hurt feelings are not the basis of a sound foreign policy. Even if Russia was right to feel entitled to a sphere of influence encompassing all the former Soviet Union, attacking Ukraine wasn't going to reverse the Baltics' entry into NATO. And it didn't prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, because Ukraine wasn't joining NATO in the first place. And even if it was, Russia could have stopped at Crimea. And also, and I cannot believe this needs to be explained to fucking geopolitics experts, Russia has a nuclear deterrent. They do not need land buffers at all. What, is it the 19th century? Are they worried about General Mannheim's zombie army? Do they also need more crossbowmen for their star forts? There's nothing realist about substituting resentment for actually making sure a war will make your country stronger. Did resentment play a role? Sure, probably. Along with Putin's fear of his domestic opposition, all the weird hyper-nationalist philosophers, and he probably really does believe this goofy spiritual thing about Ukrainians and Russians being one people. But even if you combine all that, there's still a big missing piece. And I think I have found that missing piece. But it is a weird, weird story. Like Thomas Pynchon novel Weird Story. Buckle in. And now a special thank you to my patrons. Deanna Banana, Big Nove, Theano, Kimma Berry, Tedsville, Knowing Better, Zach Christensen, Scott Beckett, Gabo Psy, Joel Gomez, Carl Neo, Armin Hindenburg, Rob Field, Red Rex, Arianai, Taboon Zubeers, Ananas, Balind Kovac, Aki665, Bernth, and Cullen.